On behalf of CEC, the Conference of European Churches, a very warm welcome, bienvenue, bienvenida, willkommen, benvenuto, to all of you who have joined us in front of your screens, maybe at home, maybe at work, for our webinar on the topic of vaccination. Vaccination, curse or blessing? I must admit, a somewhat provocative title. But I think we need to talk about it, especially as conspiracy theorists on vaccination are filling the wires on social networks. We are in an urgency situation and the issue is complex. Vaccination passport, herd immunity, variance, responsibility, only to mention some keywords. Test everything, hold fast to what is good, writes the Apostle Paul to the Thessalonians. And I think it's not about the test PCR. I think which is important is that we should discuss it. We should talk about it in the light of our different Christian traditions, Orthodox, Anglican, Protestant, Evangelical, and as well in the light of our cultural backgrounds. The strength of CEC is that despite our differences, we want to enter into a dialogue with each other, not only within our churches, but also with political and social actors in Europe, and not only in the EU. Just to present me, my name is Søren Lenz, and I'm the person in charge of the CEC office in Strasbourg. And I'm in this function CEC's representative at the Council of Europe, the biggest regional human rights organization in the world. In this context, I coordinate two CEC thematic groups. One is on education, democracy, and diversity, and the second one is on science, new technologies, and Christian ethics. And I'm pleased, therefore, to introduce the two moderators who are guiding you through this webinar. Both are members of our thematic group. And I want to welcome Julia Vidovic. She is professor at the Institut de Théologie Orthodoxe Saint-Cierge at Paris. Hello, Julia. Nice to see you on the screen.
Hello, Søren.
And she is as well chair of our thematic group. And we've got Dr. Brandon McCarthy from the Church of England. So he doesn't Brexit us, I hope. And the Church of England, a national advisor on medical ethics and health and social care policy. But before I hand over to you, we would like to ask you a very short, somewhat personal question. Anonymously, of course, it will now appear on the screen and you can answer it by ticking the appropriate box. I think now you will see it. If you could, would you get vaccinated immediately? And then you can tick the appropriate box. And now I give the floor to Julia. The floor is yours, Julia. You will take now in hand the session.
Thank you, Søren, very much for this introduction. So now I am able to present the results of the poll. So we have 69% of people responding by yes, 13% by no, and 18% are hesitating, as you can see it as well on the board.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hello, everyone, wherever you are and whatever time zone you happen to be in. I live in Ireland, even though I work for the Church of England, and my time here is a little after 3:30 in the afternoon, 4:30 in Brussels. I don't know what time it is where you are, but you're very welcome anyway. Coincidentally, just today, I got my invitation to go and get vaccinated at my local health centre on Monday. And just a secret between me and you, I'm going to take up the offer. I will be vaccinated. Now, we have 4 wonderful speakers for you this afternoon. In no particular order, I will introduce them. The Reverend Professor Gina Radford, who is a Church of England parish priest and former Deputy Chief Medical Officer of England. She's now currently also part of Public Health England's working groups working on the pandemic response in England. And she's based in England, unlike me. Then we have Professor Dr. Ulrich Koertner, who is president of the Institute for Ethics and Law at the University of Vienna. That's Vienna with a V, not Siena with an S. And Ulrich is based in Austria. Then we have Dr. John Jacobs, who's an immunologist and medical data scientist, and also a member of our thematic group. And John is based in the Netherlands. And last, but by no means least, crossing the Atlantic, we have Professor Gail Woloschak, Professor of Radiation Oncology, Adjunct Professor of Religion and Science. And Gail is based in Chicago in the United States of America. So you don't want to hear any more from me. You want to hear what these speakers have to say. And the first speaker we have for you this afternoon is John Jacobs, who's going to give an introduction to the general science of vaccination with a focus on new technologies for developing COVID-19 vaccinations. John, you're very welcome. Your 10 minutes begins now.
Thank you, Ben, for the very nice introduction. So I'll start right away with some thoughts on vaccination. Why do we want to fight this disease? I'll first go into, are mRNA vaccines safe? What is immunity? Will vaccination stop the epidemic? And a word on prevention. First, about this disease. We have a virus which enters the body, the nose, the mouth, there's a cavity. It can be isolated from there, and from there it could infect other people. But it also goes further into the body. It enters the lungs, causing lung disease, pneumonia, as it's known, severe lung disease. But it also causes a gastrointestinal infection, which could be a route of contaminating others, but it's not really clear. Either from the lungs or from the gastrointestinal, the virus comes into the circulation, causing systemic disease, which is very much complicating in all organs, in the kidney, in the liver, in the pancreas, causing thrombosis, causing diabetes, causing all kinds of problems, and also causing problems in the brain. So it's the disease that is really devastating people and has a considerable fatality rate of about 1%, dying with a higher risk for the older people and a lot of comorbidity. But also a lot of people having long COVID, with late effects, persistent infection. I just got a paper accepted on persistent SARS-2 infections, which contribute to long COVID. So basically, it's a serious disease which we should do something about. Then I'll go into mRNA vaccines, but first I'll introduce to you the central dogma of biology, because there were some things that should be clarified. We have DNA, which becomes RNA, which is transcribed into a protein. That's the central dogma of biology. And then if a cell divides, the DNA divides, and again, resulting in 2 cells, and each cell makes its new RNA and its new protein. Knowing that, if we do mRNA technology, RNA is being entered into a cell, producing protein. So it does not touch the DNA at all. And from that, the vaccine and the protein that's being produced will be outside of the cells, resulting in a B-cell response. And also, the protein is, as you could see, presented outside of the cell, resulting in cellular immunity. That is the novel aspect of these mRNA vaccines, which both are very good in introducing antibodies against the virus and inducing cellular immunity against infected cells. So if you become infected after being vaccinated, then you get your antibodies eliminating free virus, and you also have your cellular immunity eliminating the virus-infected cells. So what is the effect of vaccination on infection? The virus still exists outside of your body, and it actually can enter the nasal and oral cavity, can go to the stomach, because you need a special kind of immunity to be protected in your mucous membranes. It's immunoglobulin A, which you normally don't make after vaccination. You normally don't make it after an infection. So we'll have people who have no symptoms from these mild infections, but they can contaminate others. The protection is much better if the virus enters the lungs. It's rapidly eliminated, and even very strong if it comes in the circulation, it's immediately eradicated. So in this way, the vaccination will have a strong protection against disease. So depending on the kind of a vaccine, because we have now like 3 or 4, 5 vaccines which are already approved by the regulatory authorities, and they give a protection of 60 to 95%, but that's protection from disease. They do not protect from infection, or just partially and only temporary, as IgE is also, after natural infection, very rapidly lost. So will vaccination suffice to stop the epidemic? Well, there's not 100% protection from the disease, so still a few people will get ill. It also does not stop the epidemic, because people will still get infected. So we still need to test, to trace, to isolate people, to find people who are infected. How we can do that? Well, we have this contact tracing idea. You have a patient, see with whom she or he has been in contact, and then we can trace the contact. We also have the other way around. Since apparently somebody got infected from somebody else, we go backwards, we call it source tracing, and from source tracing we get a source, and we get new contacts from that source. And in that way, there's an efficient methodology to find everybody who could be infected, whether they have a disease or not, because I think it's very important also from other studies that only about half of the people who are infected will have some symptoms, and even a smaller fraction will have serious disease, but many will have no symptoms at all. So should we prevent the disease? And in discussion on disease, there's often this Bible text from Marcus 2, verse 17, is like where Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So this is often used as an argument against vaccination. But the interesting fact is that Jesus is referring to the righteous as being the Pharisees. So there is some sarcasm in his choice of word, that if the Pharisees are considered righteous, well, you should not see that. Only people who want to be healed should go to the doctor. So I don't think this text will be appropriate to have an opinion on vaccination. So how does the Bible think about preventing of disease? Well, prevention is an important subject in the Bible. If you go to Deuteronomy 22, you'll see, if you are building a new house, make a railing around your roof so that you don't put the blame of bloodshed on the house if somebody falls off. So preventing damage to someone else will be very important, and also preventing damage to yourself. So what are my thoughts on vaccination against SARS-2? Why should we fight the disease? Mortality and long COVID are two important reasons. Other side effects. Are mRNA vaccines safe? Well, from a technical perspective, they are. From practical studies, they also seem to be. And then vaccination will reduce disease, but we still should do our best to stop the epidemic. And vaccination is only one minor part of it and not the most important thing to stop the epidemic. And prevention is important. And according to the Bible, if you have the double command on loving, we should love God with all what is in us, including our brains. And our brains have developed vaccines, and there we should protect everybody, especially as the Bible always reiterates again, protect those who are vulnerable. So thank you. Questions are welcome.
Thank you very much, John. And as John has said, questions are welcome. I'm going to hand over to our second speaker, Gina Radford, who's going to talk about the situation in the UK, particularly from a pastoral and public health perspective. I don't know if Gina is going to be able to be on screen or not, but we will listen to her intently. So Gina, if you are ready, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Brendan. It's lovely to be with everyone. I'm sorry that you've just got a picture of me, but the technology's let us down. Probably it's just as well you can't see me because I'm a little bit cold because I've just come in from doing a funeral, another funeral on a COVID victim. And that has been my experience over the last few weeks because we had an outbreak in a nursing home with 11 deaths. And I live in a small rural village. That's a lot of deaths. So I'm just going to go through a few probably more public health issues with a bit of a theological twist. I do not pretend to be a theologian. I'm a jobbing vicar, but I am also a public health professional. So that's where I come from. And let's be clear, the issues around vaccines and concern about vaccines are not new. But this particular disease has thrown up some issues and really put the spotlight on vaccines for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the very global nature of this pandemic, the fact that it can affect all ages, although clearly some more than others. Everyone, it seems to be being affected at the same time. This is unprecedented in our generation's experience. Then, of course, we've got the speed of development of the vaccine, the new technologies used, and, of course, the rise of social media and the infodemic that seems to be upon us. So I'm just going to think of a few issues that may be worthy of consideration. Well, we've already heard from our previous speaker about safety, and that by and large, Christian medical experts would agree that from the evidence that we have available, the scientific consensus is that the vaccines are safe. And I have to declare that I have had my vaccine, and it was a Pfizer vaccine. So what about the ethics? Are vaccines moral? I'm sure we'll hear more about this from our ethicists later. But since the 1960s, as we know, almost all vaccines have utilised cell lines from aborted fetal material. And certainly this is the area that causes some consternation. And currently most cell lines are based on fetuses aborted in the 80s. Now, as far as the Church of England is concerned, we believe that all clinically recommended vaccinations can be used with a clear conscience, and that the use of such vaccines does not signify some sort of cooperation with voluntary abortion. That is our statement and that is our stance. But we have to acknowledge that there are faithful, informed Christians who believe that taking the vaccine wrongly benefits from past evil, participates in evil now, and encourages further evil through more abortion and experimentation. So I come on to my next point. Me, you, or them? Who actually benefits from being vaccinated? Well, we've heard that vaccines do protect individuals from the effects of COVID, but not 100%. Not everyone who has the jab will be protected. Our immune responses vary, and not everyone can have the vaccine. We'll continue to have a pool of susceptible people. But I would argue the vaccine is not just about protecting me, as important as that is. It's also about how we protect others and by collective action reduce the prevalence. And this latter point is one of the drivers to encourage everyone to get vaccinated, even those who are at a very low level of personal risk. Our faith teaches us that we are relational beings, created in the image of God who is relational. We have a responsibility to and for each other. We're called to serve others, sometimes at a cost to ourselves. We're called to love our neighbour. And therefore, if the valuation of life and loving my neighbour is accepted as inherent and essential to our faith, then the question has to be, do sacramental Christians have an obligation to respond in support of vaccines that could protect and improve public health? Now, there's a danger that we think of the questions about vaccination only in health terms, but there are other issues that we need to be aware of that will be gone into in more detail by other speakers. There are, of course, the questions of liberty, personal liberty and choice, and, of course, livelihood. If we have to live with continuing lockdowns every time we get an outbreak, what does that mean for people's economy and their economic chances? The Archbishop of Canterbury was recently featured having his own jab, and he quoted, "The rapid development of the vaccine is an answer to prayer. Getting the vaccine is part of that commandment to love our neighbour as ourselves." And he publicly stated he wanted to encourage everyone to get the vaccine. So then we get on to the next question about what about those who don't want to be vaccinated? Now, in the UK, we have great differences in uptake of vaccine, with 50% of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people saying that they would take the vaccine, compared to almost 80% of white people. And overall, not dissimilar to the poll we just had, 15% are refusing. In addition, we've got the challenge of misinformation, anti-vaxxers, etc. And that's not to mention the question of mandation or vaccine passports, none of which we are currently thinking of in the UK. So there are a lot of people out there who are hesitant. We also, and in 2019, WHO identified vaccine hesitancy as one of the biggest risks to health that threatens us globally, and that was before COVID. And the question then arises, how do we treat those who object to vaccines for whatever reason? And it's one thing to seek to persuade, it's another to act in judgment. But that doesn't mean we should be silent and not address any underlying misinformation or misunderstanding. We need to speak on behalf of the legitimacy of science-based medicine. And we have a very powerful voice because faith leaders, certainly in our country, in a recent poll, are seen to be more trusted than government in local communities. And we're likely to require repeat vaccinations as we go forward because this epidemic, this disease is not going to go away. So we need to address the question of vaccine hesitancy seriously. And the Church of England is trying to play its part as part of a national endeavour to encourage people to be vaccinated. Then we get on to the big issue of access to vaccines, self-interest versus the right thing to do. One of the challenges is that the supply of vaccines is limited, and so we have to prioritise. So how do we do this? On the basis of need or demand, and how do we assess need? Now, in the UK, we prioritise based on a group of experts, and it's based on those at the highest risk of dying or severe disease. But we're now getting into a more challenging area, having done the most obvious groups, as we begin to look at prioritising, for example, by occupation. But this isn't just a national issue. Over 20% of the UK population have been vaccinated, compared to 2% globally. And that is also compared to 0.6% in India. So what about global access? And at the moment, we're seeing the developed world vaccinating as many of their population as possible and even stockpiling. It's very much more likely that I received my vaccine before many millions of people who are at a far higher risk, simply because I'm English and can access the vaccine. So where does our motivation lie when looking at global distribution of something so life-saving? Now, it's only natural to want to protect ourselves from the virus at all costs. which for many motivates us towards vaccinations with a me-first mentality. But we need to understand certain issues. Firstly, that this is a global problem and needs a global solution. The emergence of the South African strain underlines this. This virus is no respecter of borders, and we're going to have to learn to live with it. Secondly, we do have issues around availability with limited supplies, costs, vaccine stockpiling. A few countries with just 16% of the world population have 60% of the world's supply. And Archbishop of Canterbury noted that Canada, for example, had ordered more than 5 times what it needs for the population. But most of us are in that situation. We also need to be aware that misinformation is being deliberately spread about the vaccines and that there are mythical dangers. That's not to in any way say that people with genuine concerns and fears should not be listened to and have their views respected. But there are also globally logistic difficulties in distributing this vaccine, and we need to address those if we are going to genuinely see a global solution. And the Church would argue that Jesus had a particular concern for the vulnerable and marginalised. And Paul reminds us that in Jesus there is no difference between us. Investing in others is not simply to reverse a problem, but to promote values of life. And it's to our advantage that everyone in the world gets a vaccination, because not just because it's the right thing to do, but because actually that's the only way that we are going to get a handle on this virus. And the Church of England is actively looking at how we can play a role to promote and support vaccine equity. Then penultimately, vaccine or vespers. What is the role of the Church? Now, there's a real practical element of all of this. We're called to love our neighbour, to be hands-on, not hands-high. Now, our churches are holy spaces, yet they are also part of communities and potentially have a role to play as offering both physical and spiritual healing. For example, Salisbury Cathedral, along with many other churches, have become vaccination centres. Members of churches have trained as vaccinators. We are part of our communities and need to serve them. So I'm going to finish with the big picture. Back in December, our Health Secretary spoke of the NHS being ready to inject hope into millions of arms this winter, clearly referring to the vaccines. An elderly Holocaust survivor received his vaccine recently as he rolled up his sleeve, revealing his Auschwitz number, and then he quoted, "And I will redeem you with an outstretched arm." Exodus 6:6. So as Christians, we need to be careful about thinking that vaccines are our great hope. We've heard that they have their limitations. They are part of our response. They are not the total solution. Now, our faith confronts the fact that there is uncertainty and risk in the lives we lead, but that grace is present in the connectedness and continuation of life. Vaccines are not going to be the whole answer to coronavirus. It's not going to eradicate it. We have to learn to live with it. And that means confronting the reality that people will die from it, vaccine or not. And the Church needs to help and be part of the dialogue about what is acceptable risk for our society and for the wider world. And I want to end with an image, that of the rainbow. Now, the rainbow has become the symbol of support and solidarity in our fight against COVID in the UK. Now, this coming Sunday, the reading from our lectionary is from Genesis of God's covenant with Noah, the hope and promise of his blessing that he sealed with the rainbow. And it reminds us that we stand in solidarity with our fellows, but we trust in God's promise. We, the Church, need in every possible way to declare through our words and actions that whilst vaccines offer us an immediate hope for a way forward in COVID, ultimately our great hope is Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina. Very, very much appreciated. I'm going to introduce our third participant, Professor Ulrich Koertner, who's going to give a Protestant perspective. Ulrich is based in Vienna, and you can see that he and I share a love of waistcoats, only Ulrich, your waistcoat is so much better than mine. So with envy, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I will give a short report about the situation and the discussion in Protestant churches in Austria, of course, where I'm living, and a little bit also in Germany, not in Switzerland. That is not my my favorite theme. Let's start with a theological reflection from a Protestant view. Christendom is the religion of freedom. Christ has set us free, writes the Apostle Paul, and freedom in the biblical sense, however, is tied back to loving others, one's neighbor, and caring for others, as we heard just before. This is what Martin Luther means when he writes that a Christian is free and subject of no one, but at the same time, he is a servant and subject to everyone. To be subject, that sounds like an authoritarian attitude. Luther, of course, is not concerned with the spirit of subservience, but with a sense of responsibility and the common good. Seen in this light, his dual thesis is highly topical. It is not a spirit of subservience, but a sense of responsibility that is demonstrated by those who follow hygiene regulations and other measures to contain the corona pandemic. Those who spread conspiracy theories or polemicize against the government's supposed corona madness are acting irresponsible. Irresponsibility is not a sign of a strength of faith, but of selfishness. Christian faith is committed to the common good. In the course of corona demonstrations, a demonstration of opponents of measures declared as a religious event took place in Vienna at the end of January. The police has prohibited all demonstrations on this day. With extensive adherence to the distance and mask rule, around 40 people gathered in the Volksgarten, that is a park in the center of Vienna. They grouped around a poster with the inscription, "Austria is free, Jesus is King." The initiator of the action was Peter Steinbacher, the founder of Hallelujah TV, which campaigns against corona measures in the social networks. After a short speech, he invited those present to talk about Jesus at the microphone and to pray for the country. The Archdiocese of Vienna had already warned in advance of the event, which was declared to be a Christian procession, and expressly distanced itself. It sees in the action an abuse of religion and religious freedom and criticizes the proximity of the demonstrators to the political right fringe. The Protestant churches have not commented publicly, but like the Catholic Church, fully support the measures taken by the government and authorities against the COVID virus, as well as vaccination. The measures against COVID are also taken seriously in the Orthodox churches in Austria. However, on several occasions, there have been corona hotspots in free church congregations. In general, the willingness to be vaccinated in Austria still leaves much to be desired. The minority of vaccination skeptics and opponents doubt the safety of the approved vaccines, polemicize against compulsory vaccination, and stir up fears, for example, of a change in the human genome through the mRNA used in the vaccines from BioNTech and Moderna. Conspiracy theorists claim that a network of people such as Bill Gates and George Soros is behind corona and the vaccination campaign. Such abstruse ideas, which are scientifically completely baseless, can also be heard at demonstrations in Austria and Germany and are spread on social media. Overall, however, the willingness to vaccinate has increased in recent weeks. However, there are reservations among members of the nursing professions At least in Austria, there are differences, however. While the willingness to vaccinate is very high among nurses in intensive care units, it is significantly lower among geriatric nurses. Due to the spread of highly contagious mutations of the virus, the situation has worsened considerably. The situation is currently particularly critical in Tyrol, which has become a hotspot for the South African mutant B1351. It should be clear to most people by now that the corona pandemic cannot be defeated without widespread vaccination, even if it's not the only solution, that's clear. Rather, there is a danger of continuing to go from one lockdown to the next. The churches in Austria and Germany support the vaccination program in their countries. For instance, the bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Austria has publicly spoken to a moral duty to be vaccinated against COVID-19. However, he opposed compulsory vaccination and appeals to people's personal responsibility. Diaconia Austria, Protestant form of Caritas, together with Caritas, Red Cross and two other social organizations, is supporting the campaign Austria Vaccinates, and Johanniter Unfallhilfe, a work of the Order of St. John, is directly involved in the vaccinations. However, the director of Diaconia Austria, Maria Moser, also emphasizes that the concerns of employees in care must be heard and taken seriously. In an interview, she explained, solidarity with the elderly, those in need of care, or those who are mentally impaired or chronically ill, cannot be enforced with a raised forefinger or by denigrating skeptical or concerned people. The latter are also to be found in the health and care sector. Concerns must be taken seriously. Our experience is that good information and open discussions significantly increase willingness to vaccinate, quote, ending. However, the bigger problem at the moment is not lack of vaccination preparedness, but rather delays in the delivery of vaccines and logistical problems with vaccination. According to the electronic vaccination record, 268,000 or nearly 269,000 people in Austria have been vaccinated until today. This corresponds to about 3% of the population. 176,000 people have already received the second vaccination and thus full immunity protection. That is about 2% of the population. As you know, the vaccines now approved give protection against the virus and the severe cause of the disease. According to current knowledge, however, it cannot be assumed that vaccinated people can no longer infect others. Even if there is, by this reason, no legal justification for compulsory vaccination, I believe that there is a moral obligation to be vaccinated because fewer patients in the COVID wards and intensive care units relieves the burden on the health system. We are all jointly responsible for ensuring that the health system continues to function efficiently. The risk associated with vaccination is apparently very low with the vaccines currently approved in Europe, although a general distinction must be made between reactions of the vaccine and long-term vaccine damage. In retrospect, it is easy to criticize the EU for ordering too few vaccine doses at the beginning. But in principle, the EU's strategy of negotiating together with the vaccine manufacturers and dividing up the quotas by mutual agreement, I think, was the right one. It was also right to coordinate vaccinations across Europe in order to restore freedom of movement within Europe as quickly as possible and to be able to reopen the borders. In the meantime, however, the pressure that has grown in the member states to buy additional quotas of their own. Europe would be in a bad way if in the end it was everyone for themselves. However, and Gina also mentioned it, Humanity, solidarity, and justice must not end at the borders of a single country or at the borders of Europe. In the domestic political discussion, at least in Austria, the poor countries are being lost from view. The COVAX initiative of WHO and 20 leading economic powers aims to make 2 billion vaccine doses available by the end of the year. There is still a shortfall of $6.8 billion for the implementation of the program for 2021 alone. NGOs have joined, as you know, perhaps forces in the People's Vaccine Alliance initiative. I think the word of the churches is also needed here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, time to cross the Atlantic to Gail Woloszak. Gail tells me that's a Ukrainian name, but I've made her an honorary Irish person, so I'm going to call her Gail Mac Woloszak. Gail is going to speak to us from a scientific and orthodox theological perspective, I believe. Over to you, Gail.
Thanks so much, Brendan. And, you know, I really like the McWallace-Jack. I'm going to have to play that out on the family. So what I want to do today is I've divided up my short talk into 3 main topics. The first thing I want to do is to sort of set the stage for what has been going on in the U.S. And it begins with pre-vaccine and goes into vaccine. And then I want to superimpose the Orthodox situation onto that, and then I'll make some kind of general comments about vaccines. So I am a scientist, but I also have a Doctor of Ministry degree, so I kind of skirt these 2 worlds of religion and science quite a bit. And what happened in the US began with the battle over the masks. There was a strong anti-science perspective that developed in a lot of communities, in a lot of parishes, and people just virtually refused to wear masks and refused to accept science. I think that my perspective on it is that there are kind of 2 reasons why that happened. One is that there are people that I call bundlers. In the US, we have this thing where you can like say, well, I want to buy a cheap cable, cheap internet, and cheap phone. I'm going to bundle them all together and it will be less expensive for me. But it also means that people don't spend the time to choose what's the best cable, what's the best internet, what's the best phone. And I think what happens for a lot of perspectives in the US is that people bundle their ideas together too. And they say, this group is anti-abortion, and this group is for prayer in the schools. And with that bundle comes anti-vaccines and anti-environmental causes and almost everything anti-science. So without thinking about it, people just go through that anti-science perspective. The second reason I think why people are really anti-science is because they actually just don't know. They don't become educated, they don't learn. So this is sort of the backdrop on which we have in our kind of religious background here in the US. So you will find even within a single faith tradition, some people that are wearing masks and some people aren't. And certainly within the Orthodox tradition, that is exactly the case too. So even here within the city of Chicago, I can go to some Orthodox parishes where 38 people developed COVID from one funeral because nobody wore a mask. And then other parishes where masking, distancing, hand washing are considered critical components. And that kind of spottiness is, I think, almost throughout every single faith tradition here. I teach at a Lutheran seminary. It's true within the Lutheran tradition, and it is certainly true within the Orthodox tradition. Now, let's move from masks then to vaccines. And unfortunately, the anti-science component goes in with the vaccines as well. There's an anti-vaxxer movement within the US that fits within that anti-science group that I talked about earlier, and they are opposed to any vaccines at all, mostly because they believe that vaccines cause autism or cause some other some other issue. I once I did a similar webinar on vaccines, and I had a woman who was emailing me every week about, what about this website that says that vaccines cause epilepsy? What about this website that says the vaccines cause autism? And finally, I said to her, look, we have a publicly available website that contains every single scientific paper. Why don't you go search it? It's called PubMed. It's available to anybody worldwide. Go search it on vaccines. You will find 400,000 papers. When you read those papers, then come back to me and talk about it. Some of them are written in perfectly easy to understand language. Let's talk about it when you go to become educated. So there's this sort of assumption that one website has everything, and that certainly is not the case for what we would find in the US today. Okay, that's the backdrop that I wanted to set the stage for. We then have how the Orthodox Church has handled it. And I would say for masking, the church has not been all that great. But now with vaccines, I do feel like the church is starting to step up. The Ecumenical Patriarch had a video of himself getting vaccinated, and that gave a good example for Orthodox for what we should be doing. Many of our local bishops, my own bishop here, the local bishop here in Chicago, Metropolitan Nathaniel, went on a video and talked about how he got his vaccine and what his perspectives were on it. All the same, there are a lot of fears among people, and fear issues can include they were developed so quickly they're not safe, the vaccines will alter my genes forever, there are microchips that have been implanted in the vaccines, and Bill Gates wants to follow us for everything we do. The vaccines will make me infertile, and those are hard issues to try to address. What a group of us in the Orthodox Theological Society of America are doing is we've compiled a frequently asked questions sheet, and we're hoping to make that be available on a website. It's not quite up. We have a couple of bishops looking at it to make sure that there are no issues, but that's going to be going up very soon, and I'll be happy to share that website with anybody that might be interested. But the other issue related to that came up from the first presentation about concerns with aborted fetuses. And I need to be really clear on this. The Orthodox Church has pretty much taken a stand that saving life is important, and that these fetuses that were aborted in the 1960s were therapeutic abortions. No new fetuses will be aborted again. But I also need to point out that the messenger RNA vaccines that much of the world is getting, that we're getting in the US right now, those were never grown in aborted fetuses. They were tested once on the cells from the aborted fetus to make sure that the vaccine would not work against fetal cells, but they would not kill fetal cells. But that was the only thing that was done. They were not grown in those cells. They were not required. Some of the other vaccines that are coming from viral sources are likely to be grown in those aborted fetal cells, because there's just no other option for being able to grow them. So that's been an issue for Orthodox, but most of our bishops have said, look, still get the vaccine. It's important. I think the other, so I think what we're seeing in most Orthodox churches right now is dialogue on it, education about it, having people come in to try to answer questions. We've been doing webinars, trying to educate people about their concerns, but most of those concerns are more safety issues than they are actually theological issues about vaccines. Those who were anti-vaxxers remain anti-vaxxers. So I think that that's sort of the stage for the Orthodox and where we're at right now. Now, I need to make some kind of general comments about vaccines, and some of these were touched upon by other speakers, but I think they're important enough for me to talk about them. The first is that getting a vaccine does not mean you don't wear a mask anymore. we want to think that the vaccines are kind of like the rubella vaccines or the polio vaccines, where you're immunized and you're never going to get sick again. That's actually not what happens for the majority of these vaccines. We don't know yet whether you are susceptible to infection. What we do know is that the vaccines prevent people from getting severe disease, but we don't know if the vaccines prevent infection. And because of that, that means that if you've been vaccinated, you can still transmit the infection to others if you become infected. So therefore, having wearing the vaccines is still required. It's required in the U.S. Wearing masks is still required if you've been vaccinated in the U.S., and I believe that's going to be the case until we have a lot more information. The second thing I think that's important to realize is that not all people can be vaccinated. There are people with certain autoimmune diseases, there are certain people with certain chronic diseases for whom the vaccine will never be recommended. They will never be able to mount a proper immune response, and the vaccine is actually dangerous for them. That's a reason why the rest of us need to be vaccinated. If we want to develop this so-called herd immunity, where a large percentage of people are protecting other people from getting the disease, they're arguing that probably we need about 70–80% at least of the population to be immune to the virus. So what that means then is that in order to protect others, we need to get the vaccine. Now, I was on a COVID call recently where there was discussion, and a friend of mine talked about what his son said. And what his son said was, if you think about it from a Christian perspective and caring for others, who would have thought that such a small thing as wearing a mask would be so hard for people when it has to do with saving lives? And I think the same thing can be said for vaccines as well. It's a very small thing, and we're protecting not just ourselves, but we're protecting others at the same time. One other point I want to make is that science is not the enemy here. There are a lot of people that have made science into the enemy, but it's not the enemy. I've been working in the science and religion dialogue for decades now, and I've noticed something very interesting. You can put a group of people from different faith traditions in the same room, and you can say to them, we are going to talk about what our faith traditions teach. And you will get a lot of arguments, a lot of discussion, picking apart words. But when you put a group of people of different faith traditions in the same room and you talk about science and scientific topics, there's actually often a lot of agreement. I believe that vaccines are a way that the communities, and I don't even just mean Christian, but all faith traditions can join together, and our joint message is going to mean a lot more to the world than just any one of our single faith traditions. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
I would like to thank all the participants. I learned a lot, and for the moment we have some questions, so do not hesitate to ask. It's the opportunity to receive the answers, or at least to receive some helps in order to bring the answer to your questions concerning this issue. But before we go to the question response period, I would like to open a second poll. And the question of this second poll is, did this webinar confirm your original response in the first poll? You can answer by yes, by no, or not fully, and we will be really glad to have your answer. And if your response are not fully, maybe you can ask your questions in order to receive the answers you're looking for. And I would like to now, while waiting for the response, which will be presented to you at the end of the conference by Soren, come back to the questions that we received. So I would like as well to invite all the speakers to open their microphones or videos as well, so that we can see them. So I organized the questions that we received in several points. One of them is, what about all the theories which pretend that vaccines are dangerous, not secure, etc.? How should we, as scientists, Christians, respond to that? I know that we already hear about this topic by different presentations, but if you want to come back to that, it seems to be one of the major questions that is coming back. And the second one, I will read them all, so you can then respond as you wish. The second one concerned the integrity of the body and the conscientious objectors. It only would play a role when there is obligation to vaccination or not. And then we have two open questions that are linked together. The only way to control the pandemic is when it is accessible to the maximum numbers of people. Okay, when poor nations cannot vaccinate their populations due to the inability to access the vaccine, the pandemic rages on and the virus keeps mutating. Eventually, the available vaccines become ineffective, even for those who have access. So how can the faith community raise it as a justice issue and work and advocate for supporting mechanisms that have been created for vaccine equity, COVAX, for example? And the second question linked to that is, how can we support the People Vaccine Initiative? The last, as I may say, open question is how to explain this resistance to science. I'll leave the floor to you. You just need to open your microphone if it's not done in order to bring answers. Gail, I see you're speaking. May I ask you to just open your microphone, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll at least start. First, I'd like to address the issue about all the mutations that are arising. So far, the vaccines are working against the mutants. There was a paper yesterday in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very important medical journal in the US, where they tested whether the Pfizer vaccine was working against the mutants, and so far they're working. We don't know, I think, long term how much this virus is going to mutate. Will it be like flu and we need to get a new vaccine every year? Or will it be a stable virus where we can get one vaccine and that's it? We just don't know. There's a lot unknown about it. The other thing I'd say in regards to the person that says about justice for countries that cannot afford vaccine, I totally agree. We are in an unusual, this is the first time the world has been in this situation where we have a pandemic that is global, where we actually have quickly developed tools to be able to fight it. We need to develop methods to be able to disseminate this very rapidly. It's not the first pandemic we've seen. I mean, polio was a major problem that the world conquered. It took a lot of time to do it, but we managed to make vaccine be available all over the world. We should be able to do that much more rapidly than we're doing it now. Right now it seems to be about vaccine supply, and we are impatient. But honestly, this happened faster than I think could have been predicted.
Thank you very much, Gail. We received another similar question: is would be. What about those who already were infected? Do they need to be vaccinated? And are they still those who can transmit the virus to the others? We heard about that they can. But
I don't want to do all the talking here, but I can at least talk from my experience. I have a worker in my lab who's Serbian, and she had COVID Her husband went to church on January 7th, Christmas, got COVID, brought it home to her. She says that the danger of getting COVID comes from being married, because all her friends got it from their husbands. But the COVID but she was told she has it. She cannot get the vaccine for 2 months, but she should get the vaccine. So that's, I think, the standard thinking.
Yes, I can add to that if you're vaccinated after having the disease, it works as a kind of a booster. So if you look from an immunological perspective, you'll get about the same response than having a second vaccination. So it definitely works. That's why we do 2 vaccinations.
But as far as we know, we are not sure that for the new Brazilian mutant, it would work in the same way. Is it right? I asked the experts here from science.
The Brazilian mutants haven't been tested. The ones that were tested in this recent New England Journal paper are variants that are popping up in the UK and the US, and I believe the South African one was also tested, but the Brazilian one hasn't been yet. You're right.
Yes, and there's some indications that it might work a little bit less because some antibodies raised after vaccination do not work as good, but it still works. But it raises concern for future mutants, I think.
I have another question to John addressed, but the others can also respond to that. Is the effect of vaccination on this rise of long COVID known? Is there a difference between the different vaccines in this respect?
That's a very tough question because we basically have no idea what causes long COVID. My hypothesis is, and which has recently partially been confirmed, is that it's a persistent disease. So in that case, we would expect vaccination to work. Others think that it's an autoimmune disease. Then I don't know if vaccination would work there or not, because that would always be very tricky. So we have to first further investigate what is exactly the mechanism of long COVID. Is it indeed persistent disease? Has been recently shown in a Nature paper showing that people after 3 months still have virus in their body, even though they're considered cured. And that would also explain a lot of features of long COVID. In that case, I would expect vaccination to work. But if it's a different mechanism, then it's much less likely to work.
Thank you. We have one question of one of our member of the working group, Bishop Maximus. I don't know if he wants to open his mic and ask it directly. I'm not able to find him on our list of participants in order to open his microphone, but if he's still here and wants to ask a question, it gives some more voices here while we are waiting for him. I have another question, which is much more linked with the Christians. Why do you think Christians are more prone to dismiss or misinformation?
I'm happy to try to answer that. I will tell you that I talked to friends of mine in the Muslim community, and they have the same problems that the Christians have. One of my colleagues actually runs a Muslim prayer group at my university, and he complains about it constantly. So I don't think it's a unique problem just for Christians. I think it's all faith traditions.
I would confirm that very much so, and that's certainly our experience in the UK. And we're doing an awful lot across the whole faith spectrum and working with other faiths to address this, because this needs to be addressed in a shared way. But virtually all faiths and beliefs have an issue with certain members finding this an extraordinarily difficult discussion to have. So absolutely agree.
Thank you. Yes, Ulrich?
Yeah, and think about Israel. you have a high number, I think at least the highest rate of percent of the population that just has been vaccinated. Nevertheless, you have a high level of COVID infection, because Orthodox Jews often are very in conflict to the public policy, the health policy of the secular state. So I want to confirm, I think it's not a special problem of one of the main religions. Maybe that, for instance, as I mentioned, in the Protestant spectrum, you have free church communities. There we had hotspots a year ago. At that time, there was no vaccination at all, but we were asked to wear face masks and so on and so on. There we had problems, but it's not a special problem of Protestantism in general, or of Orthodox Christians, or of Orthodox Jews, or Judaism in general, and so on. I would think you also have criticism against a scientific access to medical problems, also among people who are not religious believers. Yeah.
Thank you, Ulrich. So,
but just a moment. But I think it's very important to say in which way religious communities can give a contribution for more commitment for such a policy. And in this way, I think religious communities are a very important player or stakeholder, also in a public debate and in healthcare policy.
Very good. Maximus, do you have an access? Yeah. So yeah. Can you?
I think can you hear me now? Hello.
Hello, we are hearing you.
Oh, I'm very happy, and this is great. Thank you so much for your speeches. It was great. It was very delightful. Thank you so much. I just had a question. I heard before Dr. Gailey, talking about the power of communication for in public vaccination of our church leaders, and I think this is a very great thing. And I just wondered, communication speaking, do you think that this is nice, it's strong? Should we be more bold on this? Maybe more religious leaders should vaccinate publicly, maybe in other Christian denomination churches? Maybe Dr. Ulrich can answer this on this, maybe for other churches as well. I think personally, I think this is great and this is very effective. I say that because I have the experience from my congregation here, the Orthodox people here in France. I just wonder, does this work in other countries? Does this work in other churches as well? Do you think it's good? Thank you.
Can I just come in with the UK experience, and then others can speak on others? The Archbishop of Canterbury was vaccinated very publicly. It was in all the main media, lots of quotes from him. It was an extraordinarily powerful moment. So I really would encourage religious leaders Christian leaders to be thinking about role modeling. How can they role model and lead by example, and use this as an opportunity to speak into this particular debate? Because faith leaders still in most of our countries have a particular voice, and certainly in the UK are much more trusted than perhaps a government voice might be. So they have a real opportunity in this space and could really lead by example and show love in action.
Yes, Ulrich?
I'm a little bit ambiguous in this question. Why? We had a prominent case in Austria. The Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop of Vienna, has been vaccinated, but not in the public scenery, but some weeks later, after he has been vaccinated, this became public. And there was a great anger about this. Why? Because we have two not enough doses of vaccines, we have a list of prioritization, and it was said we should start with all the people in the age of 80 or older, and we have to start in the care homes, you know. And when it became public that the Archbishop has been vaccinated earlier than others, then there was the impression, oh, if you are one of the proms, then you may get quicker your vaccination than other people. And we had other cases, not by faith leaders, but majors in towns. They argued why it would be necessary to be vaccinated even if they are only in the age of 50 or so. Or the president of Caritas, a Catholic Caritas, has been vaccinated and is about 60 years old. So normally he had to wait for months before he would be vaccinated. So in this case, the public didn't say, oh, it's a good example to be vaccinated if the leaders go ahead, but it was a form of conflict that broke out by this.
Ulrich, I think you mentioned a really important issue, and I should have explained. The Archbishop got vaccinated because it was his turn. He did not step out of turn. So I think absolutely right. We shouldn't be putting ourselves forward ahead of others who maybe have a greater need, but it's when those opportunities do arise to speak into this space and to be seen to be doing that. I think that's when it's important. But you're absolutely right, Ulrich, it has to be done appropriately. And I can completely understand the backlash that happened over your particular circumstance.
But
people were saying it's a form of envy, you know.
But I do think that when it does occur, at least having a photo of the church leader being vaccinated makes a very big difference. I've seen an impact here in Chicago when the bishop was immunized and he made a public statement that he'd been immunized. A lot of people who were kind of anti-vaccines now stepped up and said, yeah, I'm going to get vaccinated when my time comes. It has a very big influence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question. Though much has already been said about the use of aborted fetuses in the development of vaccines, I just wanted to know which of the global vaccine companies are still using aborted fetuses for making vaccines.
Well, let me be really clear on this. Nobody has made any new aborted fetuses. Everything that's been done is with the same old cell lines that were developed in the 1960s from 2 therapeutic abortions. No new abortions, no new fetuses. So these cell lines were developed in the 1960s. And my own personal opinion is that, you know, a better tribute to those 2 fetuses is to save lives than to ignore that they exist. Those cell lines are going to exist. And it is our only way to make many vaccines. Rubella vaccine is made using those same cell lines. Of the vaccines that we use now, all of them have been tested on those cell lines. But right now, the messenger RNA vaccines are not grown in those cell lines. So I don't know what's going to happen with the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson. I believe they might be developed in those cell lines, but I do not believe that should influence us. I think it's actually unethical for us to say that we are not going to take the vaccine when the sacrifice was made in the 1960s, and it's actually hurtful for life to be lost because of that.
Maybe I could add something to that. Those cell lines have been immortalized, which means they keep on dividing. So from a biological perspective, they're still living and they can be multiplied indefinitely. And that means there is no need, actually. It would be undesirable to have new cell lines, because these are known, these are safe, these can be cultured very well, and that makes it a good technology to use. And you cannot undo the past, but you do, and the past was not done because of this. There were different reasons for the abortion, which I think is very important. So I think Gela made a very good argument there that we should not consider those as a result of an abortion. It's just a saline that there is, that exists, and that will continue to exist, whether we will multiply it more or less. And there's nothing changing there on the field of abortion. It's just a saline that exists.
Thank you for this answer. And we have maybe if you want, I invite the participants to ask other questions. We do not still have a lot of time. I have one question, and we can have at least two more if they arrived, before asking our speakers to conclude with one sentence about this seminar. So I'll let them think about what they want to give as a message, kind of final message, short final message to our audience. And the question I received will concern not the vaccines, but other drugs. Are there any other drugs that can be used instead of vaccines that can help? Or do we think about in this direction when dealing with the COVID?
At the moment, there are no other drugs that prevent COVID in the way that the vaccines do. Vaccines clearly work very differently, but all the time, new drugs to help us treat people who have COVID, particularly preventing some of the worst and the most serious consequences, are being developed. And just recently, we've had the development with one of the anti-arthritis drugs that has proved to be very effective against those with a more serious type of COVID. But at the moment, there are no drugs that do the same as vaccination, and I don't anticipate that being the way forward for COVID at the moment.
You know, that's absolutely correct. There are no drugs that will stop the infection even. But what they've been saying in the US now is that there's much greater availability of antibodies from people who were infected. And that's very effective at preventing severe disease when people are already infected. And that there's good broad availabilities for it. So people should just be aware of that.
Thank you. There's another question concerning the number of vaccines that we can receive. In some media, they said that it is okay to receive 3 or 4, but after the 5, that you can have problems. Do we have any responses?
We don't know. We haven't. People forget how new these vaccines are and how new this strain of COVID is. We're still learning all of this, so we don't know how many times that you can be vaccinated. There is also some interesting debate going on about whether you can be vaccinated by 2 different types of vaccine, for example. But we still don't have definitive answers around that, and we won't have for some time.
So thank you, Gino, for your answer. And before giving the floor to Soren for conclusive remarks, I would like to ask our panelists to give that brief message. What do they want to bring with this exchange on vaccine, and what do they want to address to public?
I talk too much, but I can start. I mean, I think my message that I would like to convey is that faith communities have a lot to say here and can actually change the shape of the way people believe about vaccines. We need to get to work and do that.
Thank you. Yes, Ulrich?
My point is, the first is the same. I think faith communities, especially we're talking about Christian churches, have a great responsibility to enforce commitment in the population for vaccination. And for me, that's a question of solidarity, but also of justice. So, for instance, that the vaccination has to be free, that you mustn't pay for that, that you have to think about that COVID concerns the whole society, but in a different deepness. There are poor people or people that are unemployed now who suffer much more by COVID-19 than people with a good income, for instance, and a good healthcare system and so on. So I think this is a great responsibility of the churches. And by that, the second is that we have to be aware what Gina said. Vaccination is very, very important from my viewpoint, but it's not the great solution. It's a very important element of a complex strategy for fighting against COVID or SARS-CoV-2. We have new strength. We perhaps will not talk about only about one pandemic, but about 3 or 4 pandemics. Maybe that this is the entrance of a age of pandemics and not only a short event in the history. And by that, the churches should support again the other tools, for instance, wearing masks and to look for distance and so on. And the general question is, what would think about justice? What will be just? For instance, that people who are vaccinated should have more rights than others who are not vaccinated? Is it so to say the ticket for free riding and so on, or maybe there a situation where we have to discuss about compulsory vaccination for the moment. In my country, everyone who is dealing with this problem says, oh, we should say it is free and you are not enforced to be vaccinated. But if there would be new results that people who are vaccinated will not be only healthy for themselves, but also they can not influence, other people, then I think we should talk about obligations. That is for the moment not the question. And so the general question, what is social justice and what is a theological access to this, is also very important for dealing with all these ethical problems that are concerned by COVID-19.
Thank you, Ulrich. John or Gina?
Okay. I think vaccination is very crucial for protection against disease. Our body is a temple, and we should be take very good care of it. I don't think vaccination will be the most important measure against the epidemic, against the spreading. There we need other things, and we need to collaborate. They're also keeping that in mind, that we have to stop the epidemic together. And then it's not about people being vaccinated, but whether people are contagious. Because people who are contagious, we should have good facilities of isolating them. So first identifying them by testing, and then isolating them, then taking care of them. That also means, and then thereby we should stop as a world together spreading of the epidemic, because it can be done, as it has been shown in Asia and Australia, but it should also be done in Europe and America.
Thank you.
Just a few words to me. I think the most important thing is that we as a church speak into this space. We firstly can say much to encourage and support the accurate information, both amongst our own members and to the wider public. But we can also shine the spotlight on those issues that we need to draw attention to, some of which have been mentioned, some of the social justice issues. And I think that the church needs to take the opportunity of speaking into this space. This is a time to put our heads above the parapet, to find our voices and to articulate our messages. And we need to do that with courage and with prayer.
Thank you very much.
The idea for this webinar is from a guide for public space from the Council of Europe's Bioethics Committee. And I think the concluding words are very important. We have to discuss it. We have be open for all kind of discussions about this to create trust and acceptance in our communities and in public. And I can just announce the results of our poll, the last poll. We have 85% yes, and we have 7% no, and 7% not fully convinced. So, or not fully confirmed. So I think it's just a sort of overview of this. Has this changed something in your view? What I want to say is thank you very much for to the speakers for the time you have taken. Thank you for the excellent contributions. Thank you, our thematic group, who has organized this together with me. And I think that's important that we will have this discussion in our churches and in the Conference of European Churches as well, and that we share our manière, dirais-je, to discuss this problem. Thank you to all participants. I hope this webinar has greatly helped to clarify and also to encourage further reflection and discussion within your churches. If you're interested in our work, in the work of the thematic group, please feel free to contact us. And all information can be found on the website. It's CEC Europe.org. CEC Europe, one word. And to please my colleague Brandon, I want to close with a blessing from Ireland. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. The rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Au revoir de Strasbourg. Goodbye from Strasbourg. Auf Wiedersehen.